Welcome to our channel, where we explore the fascinating and often forgotten aspects of history. In this video, we're diving into the world of Victorian London and what people ate during this transformative period in history. From the humble street food sold by vendors in the busy streets to the lavish meals served in the finest mansions, the food culture in Victorian London was as diverse as the city itself. This story will take you through the daily diet of the poor and the extravagant feasts of the rich, highlighting the contrasts, the innovations, and the struggles that shaped the eating habits of Londoners in the 19th century. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel and like the video to help us bring more of these historical stories to you. We'd love to know from which location you're watching this video. Comment below and let us hear from you. In Victorian London, food was not just a necessity. It was a reflection of the social class system, with striking differences between the meals of the rich and the poor. The Industrial Revolution had radically altered the way food was produced, distributed, and consumed, creating a city that was bursting with new foods, new methods of preparation, and new ways of dining. For the wealthier classes, food was a symbol of status, with lavish banquets and gourmet meals that could span hours. Meanwhile, for the poor, food was a matter of survival, and many people struggled to put a decent meal on the table. 5 million by the end of the century. This urban boom created a demand for cheap, accessible food for the working masses. In the streets of London, food vendors became a common sight, offering a wide range of inexpensive options for those who couldn't afford to dine in restaurants. At the same time, the wealthy elite were living in luxury, indulging in elaborate meals prepared by the finest chefs. The sharp contrast between these two extremes offers a fascinating look at the social dynamics of Victorian London. For the working-class Londoners, eating out was a regular occurrence, but it wasn't like the restaurants we know today. Street food vendors, known as, quote, costermongers, played a huge role in feeding the masses. These vendors would set up shop in the streets, selling food from push carts or small stalls. The variety of food on offer was astonishing. You could buy anything from simple bread and cheese to more elaborate meals like meat pies or fried fish and chips. The street food culture in Victorian London was deeply ingrained in the daily life of the working-class citizens, and it reflected the practicality and resilience of Londoners in the face of the hardships they faced. One of the most iconic and beloved street foods of Victorian London was fish and chips, which became a staple of the working-class diet. Fish, particularly cod and haddock, was readily available from the Thames, and chips, or fried potatoes, were a cheap and filling side dish. The combination of the two was affordable, satisfying, and easily eaten on the go, making it the perfect street food. By the late 19th century, fish and chip shops had become a fixture in London, and the dish had firmly established itself as a comfort food for the working class. The meal was often accompanied by malt vinegar and sometimes peas, and it was served wrapped in newspaper for convenience. In addition to the food sold by costermongers, there was also a growing market for ready-made meals in Victorian London. The rise of the industrial kitchen led to the mass production of prepared food, which could be sold in shops or delivered to homes. The wealthy could afford to dine in restaurants, and the middle class could rely on takeout or delivery for their meals. But for the poor, the majority of their meals still had to be cooked at home, and many relied on inexpensive ingredients like bread, potatoes, cabbage, and cheap cuts of meat to make do. Despite the widespread poverty in Victorian London, there were still moments of community and celebration, and food played an important role in bringing people together. Street food was not only a way to feed the masses, but it also allowed people to socialize and take a brief respite from their hard lives. Costermongers often had a sense of community, and their customers were loyal, often returning to the same vendor for their meals. This created a social fabric in the streets of London, where people would talk and exchange news while eating their affordable meals. The act of eating street food was not just about nourishment, but about creating bonds and participating in the city's ever-evolving social scene. For the wealthier citizens of London, food was not just a necessity, it was an art form. The upper classes would dine in grand dining rooms, decorated with expensive furniture, crystal chandeliers, and fine china. Meals could last for hours, with multiple courses and a variety of exotic ingredients that were unavailable to the lower classes. French cuisine became especially popular during the Victorian period, and many of the finest restaurants in London offered French-inspired dishes. The wealthy would often hire private chefs to prepare elaborate meals in their homes, and banquets were occasions for showing off one's wealth and status. Meals for the elite could include dishes like roast beef, game, and rich gravies, often accompanied by fancy sauces and exotic fruits. Desserts were also a big part of high-class dining, with puddings, tarts, and cakes being served in abundance. For those who had the means, afternoon tea became a ritual in itself. Tea, sandwiches, and cakes were served in the afternoon, often with a sense of ceremony and refinement. The rise of department stores and food emporiums like Fortnum and Mason in London helped fuel the luxury food market, offering gourmet products and delicacies to the city's elite. Fortnum and Mason in London helped fuel the luxury food market, offering gourmet products and delicacies to the city's elite. The Victorian middle class also had a growing interest in food, though their meals were not as extravagant as those of the rich. The middle class still ate in their homes, but they began to embrace the idea of dining out more often. Restaurants catering to the middle class offered a more affordable, yet still satisfying, alternative to the lavish dining of the wealthy. Meals in these restaurants were often served in a more informal manner, but they still adhered to certain codes of etiquette and quality. The middle class also embraced the concept of family dining, with larger portions and simpler foods compared to the upper class. However, it wasn't just the elite and middle classes who were thinking about food in new ways. The Industrial Revolution had brought about advancements in food preservation, leading to the widespread use of canned goods and preserved meats. This allowed people to store food for longer periods and made it easier for them to buy food in bulk. It was also during the Victorian period that the modern supermarket began to take shape, with retailers offering a variety of goods to the increasingly urban population. For the first time in history, people had access to prepackaged foods and ready-to-eat meals that didn't require hours of preparation. But for many poor families, food was still hard to come by. The struggle to afford basic necessities like bread and meat was an ongoing issue for the working class. Even though there were many affordable food options in the streets, the cost of living in Victorian London remained high. For the poorest families, hunger was a constant companion, and many children went without proper meals. The social divide between the rich and poor was made all the more evident by the stark differences in food availability and quality. As the 19th century progressed, the food culture in Victorian London underwent remarkable changes, shaped by social, economic, and technological developments. These changes were not only driven by the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the middle class, but also by the emergence of new global trade networks that brought foreign goods into the city. As new ingredients, cooking techniques, and dining customs found their way into London, they contributed to the widening gap between the elite and the poor. The expansion of London's food scene reflected broader shifts in society, with food becoming a powerful symbol of class, status, and accessibility. For much of the Victorian era, food was a significant indicator of social class. The wealthier classes had access to a broad variety of foods, many of which were exotic and expensive. In contrast, the poor had limited access to anything beyond basic staples. As the middle class began to emerge during the 19th century, the relationship between food and social mobility became more complex. The middle class, though far removed from the excesses of the wealthy, began to embrace a more refined lifestyle that included dining out and enjoying foods that were once reserved for the elite. For the working class, food choices were largely dictated by necessity and economics. However, even for the poor, food began to represent aspirational mobility. As more affordable options became available, such as cheap cuts of meat and bread, the desire to move up the social ladder often reflected a wish to eat better, to move beyond a life of bare sustenance to one of taste and variety. This was especially evident in the changing attitudes towards public houses and beer gardens, where the working class would gather to consume food and drink in settings once exclusive to the wealthier segments of society. These changes were not just about expanding the menu, but about the rituals of eating. By the mid-1800s, the rise of the Victorian middle class led to the development of a more structured dining etiquette, influenced by the French. Afternoon tea, a meal traditionally enjoyed by the upper class, was now becoming a daily ritual for middle-class families. Tea rooms and lunch spots catered to this new demand, and it soon became a tradition for middle-class women to partake in tea, sandwiches, and cakes in social settings. This shift reflected the growing importance of social gatherings and a new era of refined eating. For the elite, food was more than just sustenance. It was an expression of power and taste. Wealthy Victorians enjoyed elaborate banquets, where multiple courses were served over hours. Exotic foods, such as caviar, lobster, and imported fruits, were a sign of prestige. The dining room itself was often an expression of wealth, with elegant table settings and fine china used to impress guests. This obsession with status was most evident in the lavish dinners and parties hosted by London's aristocracy, where elaborate dishes, ranging from roast venison to soup tureens, would be accompanied by wines, liquors, and champagne. These feasts weren't just about eating. They were an opportunity to display one's social rank and cultural knowledge. The expanding global trade networks of the 19th century brought with them an influx of new ingredients into London. These were goods that had once been reserved for the wealthiest of society, but as shipping and rail networks improved, they became more accessible to people of various social classes. The emergence of spices, tropical fruits, and exotic meats transformed the food landscape of Victorian London. Perhaps the most popular and widely consumed imported item was tea. By the 1850s, tea had become the quintessential drink of the British middle and upper classes. Indian and Chinese tea were imported in large quantities, and the ritual of afternoon tea became a daily staple. The demand for tea became so high that it led to the growth of a complex system of tea trading, and led to the rise of companies like Twinings and Fortnum and Mason, which began to cater to a growing middle-class clientele. Tea wasn't just a beverage. It was a cultural symbol, representing comfort, refinement, and status. The availability of sugar also grew significantly during the Victorian period. As global trade networks brought sugar from the Caribbean, it became more affordable and widely available. Sugar was used not only in teas and desserts, but in everyday cooking. The increase in sugar consumption had a profound impact on both the food industry and health. The Victorian sweet tooth flourished, and foods like cakes, tarts, and jam became staple items in British homes. Coffee, too, began to find its place in London's dining culture, though it remained less popular than tea. The availability of cocoa beans from colonies in the Caribbean led to the rise of hot chocolate as a popular drink among the elite. Spices such as cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, which had once been rare and costly, became more common in the kitchens of Victorian homes. These spices added flavor and depth to Victorian dishes, which were increasingly influenced by French cuisine. Exotic fruits like oranges, pineapples, and bananas, once reserved for the rich, became increasingly available to middle-class families. The wealthy, who could afford to purchase these fruits year-round, would enjoy pineapple in their desserts, or as a symbol of wealth. The fruit was considered a luxury item and was often used to garnish elaborate dishes. With the expansion of trade routes, these items were now found in grocery stores and markets across London, symbolizing the growing prosperity of the Victorian age. While the Victorian era saw the introduction of a wider variety of foods, this period also faced significant health challenges. Poor hygiene and overcrowded living conditions in London's slums led to the spread of diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis, which were exacerbated by unsanitary food handling practices. Public health was an ongoing concern, and while food innovation was rapidly growing, so too was the understanding that food hygiene played a critical role in maintaining health. Many people in the lower classes continued to rely on cheap, high-calorie foods like bread, potatoes, and gravy, which, while filling, often lacked the nutrients needed to fight disease. Malnutrition was common in the poorest areas of London, where a lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables meant that many children and adults alike had weakened immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. The lack of refrigeration and proper storage made it difficult to preserve food safely, leading to frequent outbreaks of foodborne illnesses. Despite these challenges, there was also a growing awareness of the relationship between food and health. Victorian doctors and health reformers began to understand the importance of balanced diets and sanitation. This awareness eventually led to improvements in food safety, though it was a slow process. The Public Health Act of 1848 aimed to reduce pollution in the streets and improve sanitation in homes and public spaces. As a result, the healthier options for the middle and upper classes began to take hold. The wealthier classes, who had access to cleaner living conditions and better food, were able to maintain a relatively healthy diet. In contrast, the working class continued to suffer from the consequences of poor living standards, which affected their ability to enjoy a nutritious and varied diet. This gap in food access was not just a matter of choice. It was a matter of social inequality, which continued to define much of Victorian society. Along with the growth of food variety and the influence of French cuisine, there was a rise in the popularity of cookbooks during the Victorian era. The middle and upper classes turned to cookbooks for recipes that reflected their growing interest in sophisticated dining. Cookbooks like Isabella Beeton's Book of Household Management, first published in 1861, became hugely popular, offering middle-class families the chance to replicate the dining habits of the elite. These cookbooks didn't just provide recipes. They offered advice on running a household, managing servants, and creating the ideal Victorian home. As the population of London grew during the Victorian era, so did the food culture. The street food vendors, or costermongers, were a central part of the city's daily rhythm. They operated in the open air, selling affordable and simple foods to the working class, who could not afford to eat in restaurants or dine at home with servants. These vendors sold everything from hot pies and roast chestnuts to pickled herring and fried fish, offering a vital source of food for those who lived in poverty. The popularity of street food among the working classes can be seen as both a necessity and a form of social connection. It was not just about the food itself, but about the experience, the shared moments of eating and gathering in the busy streets of Victorian London. The role of costermongers went beyond providing food. They also offered a sense of community. People would gather around street vendors, engaging in conversations and exchanging news, making the food market not just a place of sustenance, but a social hub. These vendors became a part of the urban landscape, with many selling their goods in specific districts known for certain foods. For example, fishmongers could be found near the riverbanks, while fruit and vegetable stalls were more common in the marketplaces. While the poor depended on street food to survive, they also formed a strong sense of identity around these foods. Fish and chips, which was introduced in the mid-1800s, became a staple meal for the working class. This dish, a combination of battered fish and fried potatoes, was affordable, filling, and quick to eat. It wasn't just a meal. It became a symbol of working-class life. By the late 19th century, fish and chip shops had become a fixture in London, serving as a comfortable, familiar place where people could grab a quick meal. This food, though simple, became comforting for the working-class citizens who were struggling with the harsh realities of industrial life. For the middle class, dining became a way to showcase their prosperity and refine their status. With the growing availability of exotic ingredients, the middle class embraced more sophisticated forms of eating, and restaurants catering to this emerging market began to thrive. However, these restaurants were still far less lavish than those frequented by the elite. The middle class enjoyed the luxury of dining out more often, and it became a social activity. But the experience was far removed from the extravagant banquets held in the mansions of the rich. The elite, on the other hand, were living in a world of opulence and excess. Banquets could last for several hours, and the number of courses could be staggering. French cuisine was heavily favored by the Victorian upper class, and it greatly influenced the way meals were prepared and served. Dishes like coq au vin, escargot, and pâté became fashionable, and the wealthy sought to distinguish themselves through their knowledge of fine dining. The experience of dining in these grand homes was one of social prestige, and the food was often lavish, with intricate plating, rare ingredients, and extravagant presentations. These meals were not only about consumption, but about the performance, the act of impressing guests with culinary skills and the ability to afford expensive imports. With such a sharp contrast in the way different classes experienced food, it is easy to see how food became more than just sustenance. For the wealthy, food was a luxury, a way to display power and distinguish themselves from the lower classes. Meanwhile, for the poor, food was often a matter of survival, something to fill the stomach and keep going. The gap between the rich and poor in London wasn't just seen in the clothes they wore or the homes they lived in, but in the food they ate. The lavish banquets of the aristocracy and the humble, often unhealthy meals of the working class painted a clear picture of the disparities in Victorian society. While food was an essential part of daily life in London, it also became an issue of public health. The rapid urbanization of the city created major challenges in terms of sanitation and disease control. The crowded living conditions in the slums, combined with poor waste management, meant that diseases spread quickly. Cholera outbreaks were common, and the working-class population suffered the most. Foodborne illnesses were rampant, and the lack of proper sanitation in street food stalls often made food unsafe to eat. Many vendors, driven by the need to make a living, would serve food in unsanitary conditions, leading to further risks of contamination. The rise of foodborne diseases created a public outcry, and the government began to address the situation with some urgency. In 1848, the Public Health Act was introduced, marking one of the first attempts by the government to regulate sanitation in urban areas. The act focused on improving waste management, cleaning up the streets, and ensuring that food was sold under safer conditions. These efforts helped improve the safety of food in public spaces, but the fight against disease and unsanitary conditions was a long and difficult one. The Victorian era saw many advancements in public health, but the challenges of a growing population and a lack of infrastructure made it an ongoing struggle. Sanitation reform was slow to come, but by the end of the century, improvements in the health of Londoners were beginning to be seen. The construction of sewers and the regulation of food stalls and markets helped reduce the spread of diseases like cholera and typhus. However, for the working class, access to safe food was still often limited by cost. The cheapness of street food often meant that people had little choice but to risk eating food that had been prepared in unsafe conditions. The growing awareness of food hygiene was a result of this struggle, and over time, it became clear that public health and food safety were inextricably linked. By the late Victorian era, the government had begun to regulate food production more rigorously, with the introduction of food laws designed to ensure that food was safe for consumption. The establishment of the Food and Drugs Act in 1875 was a significant milestone in protecting the public from dangerous foods. This legislation laid the groundwork for modern-day food safety standards and demonstrated the growing awareness of the need to protect consumers from the dangers of unsanitary food handling. As food safety improved, so did the diets of the working class. The availability of fresh produce and the increasing focus on hygiene and sanitation meant that people were starting to eat a more nutritious and balanced diet. However, the wealth gap remained, and while the middle and upper classes had access to better quality food, the poor still struggled to get by. Food remained a marker of class, with the wealthy enjoying gourmet meals while the poor relied on cheap, filling foods like bread, potatoes, and gravy. Despite these challenges, the street food culture remained strong throughout the Victorian period. It provided an important source of affordable nourishment for the working class and continued to evolve throughout the century. The introduction of new foods, new preparation methods, and new ways of eating helped shape the landscape of food in London, and the impact of these changes can still be seen in the city today. As the Victorian era progressed, the rapid growth of London and the changes brought about by the Industrial Revolution increasingly made food not just a matter of taste or convenience, but also of public health. The urbanization of London meant that millions of people now lived in densely packed, overcrowded neighborhoods where disease and poor sanitation were rampant. Poor hygiene in street food vendors' carts, inadequate food handling practices, and the lack of safe water supplies made foodborne illness a constant threat. The rise of public health reforms and food safety regulations became crucial in improving the diets and the general health of the working class, and these reforms would have lasting impacts on food culture in Victorian London. For much of the early Victorian period, the growing industrial population lived in what could only be described as horrific conditions. The slums were overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and lacked proper sanitation. The combination of these factors, coupled with the fact that much of the food consumed in the poorest districts was sold from open-air street vendors who had little regard for cleanliness, made London a breeding ground for disease. The working-class families living in these areas had to contend with both the physical demands of factory labor and the continual threat of disease, which spread rapidly through the unsanitary conditions in which they lived. Cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis were constant companions for the poor. The narrow, congested streets were often filled with the stench of sewage, and food vendors, many of whom sold items like fish, meat pies, sweets, and fried potatoes, had no means of preserving their products, leading to contamination. In this atmosphere, food became a battleground between necessity and health, and the social class divide in the city was reflected not just in living conditions, but in what and how people ate. The middle class and upper class, who had better access to resources, often dined in cleaner, well-regulated environments, such as private homes or higher-end restaurants. As these wealthier Londoners began to gain greater control over their surroundings, they also exerted pressure on local authorities to clean up the streets and improve public health. The rise of public health reforms coincided with growing awareness of the need to regulate food preparation, and these reforms would eventually help transform the working-class diet, providing a safer, cleaner, and more nutritious array of food for London's most vulnerable population. One of the most significant turning points in improving public health was the passage of the Public Health Act of 1848, which was the first major piece of legislation designed to address the overcrowding and lack of sanitation in cities like London. The act created a central board of health that was tasked with overseeing improvements in living conditions and food safety. It was at this time that the government began to focus more directly on the dangers posed by unsanitary food and unsafe food handling. Alongside these public health reforms came the increasing recognition of the need for better food regulation, especially in street food markets where the majority of the poor obtained their daily meals. As public health issues grew in importance, London's food vendors found themselves under increasing scrutiny. While costermongers and other street food vendors had once operated with little regulation, the rising awareness of food safety meant that their operations were now closely monitored. The goal was to ensure that food was being prepared in clean, hygienic conditions and that it was safe to eat. Although food vendors continued to sell on the streets, local authorities began to implement measures that required vendors to maintain higher standards of cleanliness in their carts, stalls, and food preparation methods. This shift would gradually lead to improvements in the quality of food sold to the public. At the same time, the rapid expansion of the railroad system and the increasing availability of refrigeration and canning techniques meant that food could now be transported and preserved for longer periods. These technological advancements revolutionized the way food was stored, distributed, and sold. For the middle class, this meant that the variety of food available grew exponentially. The once elite foods that were served only in fine restaurants and aristocratic households now became more accessible, although still expensive. For the working class, it meant that access to safer, fresher, and more affordable foods became increasingly possible, though still not guaranteed. With the improvements in sanitation, public health, and food distribution came a change in the quality of food available to the working class. By the mid-19th century, the rise of pre-packaged foods and canned goods helped create a more stable food supply in urban areas. Canned vegetables, meats, and preserved fruits were increasingly available in local markets, making it easier for working-class families to store food for longer periods. These products were often inexpensive and provided a much-needed alternative to the spoiled, contaminated food that had previously been a common part of life in the slums. By the end of the 19th century, the rise of public markets, where food was sold under regulated conditions, also helped to improve food access and safety for the working class. These markets, such as Smithfield Market for meat or Billingsgate Market for fish, became hubs for fresh, safe food, which was now inspected for quality and cleanliness. Market inspectors ensured that the food was free from contamination and safe to eat. Additionally, these improvements in food safety went hand in hand with the growing movement toward food preservation and food safety education, which gradually helped the public better understand the importance of cleanliness in food preparation and storage. At the same time, the growing recognition of the importance of food in maintaining health and preventing disease led to dietary changes among both the rich and the poor. The wealthier classes began to focus more on nutritious food and the benefits of balanced diets embracing foods that would help improve their well-being. Vegetables such as cabbage and potatoes, along with healthier cuts of meat, became more widely consumed, and pale, refined sugars and processed grains started to be replaced with more nutritious whole foods. Additionally, diets were becoming more balanced, as the growing middle class also started to value the benefits of food that provided energy, rather than simply indulging in rich, heavy meals. While food access was improving for the working class, the health of the poor continued to be a concern throughout the Victorian era. Poor diet, combined with the unsanitary living conditions in the slums, led to widespread malnutrition and disease. Despite the improvements in food safety and sanitation, the gap between the classes remained stark, and the working class often had to rely on cheap, filling food like bread, potatoes, and gravy to survive. Although these foods were abundant, they often lacked the essential nutrients needed for good health. As a result, many working-class families continued to face health challenges, even as the public health reforms helped reduce the overall prevalence of foodborne diseases. The latter half of the 19th century saw dramatic changes in the food culture of London. The middle class embraced more sophisticated dining habits, while the working class began to benefit from improved food safety and access to better quality food. By the end of the Victorian era, London's food scene had undergone a dramatic transformation, with street food vendors operating under greater regulation and hygiene standards, and the global food market providing access to more diverse and nutritious options. These shifts had lasting impacts on food culture in London and set the stage for the modern food systems we rely on today. The legacy of these reforms and innovations in food safety, combined with the changing diets of the poor and middle classes, laid the groundwork for future generations to enjoy a healthier, more accessible food system. Although the Victorian era was marked by inequality and hardship, the progress made during this time would eventually lead to a more equitable and healthier society. As the Victorian era came to a close, the profound changes in London's food culture began to take shape in a way that would resonate through the 20th century and beyond. The rise of modern food industries, along with the continued shift toward more sophisticated dining customs, set the stage for the development of a global food economy. What had begun as a struggle for survival for the poor and a symbol of status for the wealthy had evolved into a more organized, regulated, and dynamic food landscape, one that would influence the future of dining not only in London, but around the world. The Industrial Revolution had brought about dramatic shifts in nearly every aspect of daily life, and food was no exception. The growth of the food industry was spurred by advancements in technology, transportation, and preservation techniques. The introduction of the railroad system and steamships allowed food to be transported faster than ever before. This, in turn, opened up global trade routes and made it possible for Londoners to enjoy foods from all corners of the world. By the late 19th century, the once exclusive luxury foods of the wealthy elite were becoming increasingly available to the growing middle class. Along with this rise in availability, new preservation methods, such as canning and refrigeration, started to reshape the food market. Canning, in particular, allowed food to be stored for longer periods, eliminating the need for immediate consumption. This revolutionized food storage for both the working class and the wealthy, ensuring that fresh food could be consumed even when it was out of season or had been transported from far away. By the turn of the century, canned foods such as vegetables, meats, and fruits were commonplace in grocery stores, and they had become an essential part of the food supply, both for the working class who needed affordable options and for the middle class who sought convenience. In addition to the impact of canning and refrigeration, the rise of the modern supermarket and department stores in the late 19th century also marked a pivotal shift in how people accessed food. Fortnum and Mason, which had originally catered to the elite, began to expand its offerings to include a wider variety of products, making its luxury goods accessible to a broader market. These stores became more than just places to purchase food. They became a part of a lifestyle, representing the rise of the consumer class and the increasing democratization of once elite food products. The development of mass production techniques in food manufacturing had already begun in the Victorian era, but reached new heights in the early 20th century. Factories producing everything from breads and baked goods to processed meats and preserves began to emerge in large numbers, especially in the burgeoning industrial cities. These food factories were designed to produce items in large quantities, making food more affordable and accessible to the masses. With the use of machinery, the process of food production was revolutionized. And by the 20th century, industrial food production had moved beyond simple preservation to the creation of convenient, pre-packaged meals. At the same time, Victorian dining customs played an important role in shaping the modern restaurant culture. The growing middle class embraced dining out as a social activity, and the popularity of restaurants continued to rise. While restaurants in earlier years had been the domain of the wealthy, by the end of the 19th century, they had become increasingly accessible to people from all walks of life. The idea of public dining, which had emerged in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, began to flourish. Bistros, cafes, and diners began to spring up throughout London, and these dining establishments became a place for people to meet, eat, and engage in conversation. One of the most notable shifts in dining habits was the standardization of meals. As the Victorian era moved into the early 20th century, the idea of a full meal, including starters, mains, and desserts, became an established pattern in many middle-class households. The emphasis on structured mealtimes with specific courses and the introduction of meal etiquette further solidified the concept of formal dining. This shift also reflected the growing importance of food, not just for sustenance, but as a means of socialization. As dining out became more commonplace, restaurants began to cater to a broader clientele by offering a variety of foods that would suit different tastes and preferences. The influence of French cuisine on Victorian dining continued well into the 20th century, and many of the culinary traditions introduced during the Victorian era remain strong in modern dining. The appreciation for rich sauces, elaborate presentations, and multi-course meals persisted, even as more accessible, quick meals like sandwiches and fast food began to rise in popularity. The upper class maintained their fondness for gourmet dining, but the middle and lower classes began to experience new types of food and meals that reflected their growing access to food from different parts of the world. The emergence of new food technologies, such as refrigerators and microwaves in the 20th century, would make the future of food even more convenient. The rise of canned goods, frozen foods, and pre-packaged meals would forever change the way people ate. Meals at home, which once took hours to prepare, could now be prepared in minutes. The invention of the refrigerator allowed families to store food for longer periods, reducing food waste and improving food safety. This transformation, which began in Victorian London, would shape the global food industry for generations to come. As food became more industrialized, the social aspect of eating changed as well. With the rise of ready-made meals and takeout food, eating out or at home became more about convenience than the social or ceremonial aspects of dining. Yet, for many, the ritual of eating remained an important part of family and social life. The restaurant industry also grew during the 20th century, and new innovations in fast food and cafeterias emerged, driven by the increasing pace of life and the rise of a consumer-driven economy. In London, as in many major cities, the idea of quick, affordable dining was embraced by workers and families alike. The cultural shifts that began in the Victorian era were thus the groundwork for modern food culture. The development of the global food market, the rise of industrial food production, and the growing importance of dining out all contributed to the shaping of modern eating habits. The contrasts in food access between the wealthy and the poor in Victorian London are still evident today, though the gap has narrowed significantly due to advancements in technology, globalization, and social reforms. The influence of Victorian dining customs can still be seen in many aspects of today's food culture. The concept of a multi-course meal, the appreciation of international cuisine, and the increasing availability of prepared foods all trace their roots to this era. The period also set the stage for the development of modern food industries, which continue to evolve as they meet the demands of a globalized society. As we look back at the food culture of Victorian London, we can appreciate how food, once a simple necessity, has become a symbol of identity, status, and accessibility. It is a testament to how food can reflect the changes in society and shape the way we interact with the world around us. The legacy of the Victorian era continues to influence the way we eat, the way we view food, and the way we connect with each other through the simple act of dining. As we reflect on the rise of the modern food industry, it is impossible to ignore the lasting impact that the Victorian era had on shaping the way food is produced, consumed, and marketed today. The industrialization of food, which began in earnest during the Victorian period, laid the foundation for the global food systems that exist now. Victorian food innovations, from canning and preservation methods to the rise of food markets and modern supermarkets, had a profound effect on the way food was distributed and consumed. These innovations set the stage for the rise of fast food chains, convenience foods, and a food system that increasingly catered to a consumer-driven economy in the 20th century. One of the most significant changes in food during the Victorian era was the development of canning and food preservation technologies. The canning of fruits, vegetables, meats, and other products made it possible to store food for long periods, revolutionizing food access. Canning allowed food to be transported across great distances without the risk of spoilage, opening up new markets for global trade. In the Victorian period, these early canning techniques were used primarily to preserve food for military use or to feed the growing population in urban areas. By the late 19th century, canned goods had become increasingly popular in the homes of the middle class, as they offered a convenient and long-lasting alternative to fresh food. The impact of canning on modern food production cannot be overstated. By the turn of the century, canned food became a staple in many households around the world, especially in urban areas where access to fresh produce was limited. The global trade in canned foods opened up new opportunities for international markets and changed the way food was distributed and consumed. Companies like Campbell's Soup and Del Monte emerged in the early 20th century, building on the foundation laid by the Victorians in developing large-scale food production systems. The practice of canning continues to be a cornerstone of modern food distribution and has led to the mass production of not only fruits and vegetables, but also ready-to-eat meals and convenience foods. Another key innovation in the Victorian period was the development of refrigeration. While refrigeration was still in its infancy during the Victorian era, it laid the groundwork for the mass production of chilled and frozen foods. Refrigeration made it possible to store perishable foods like meat, dairy, and seafood for extended periods, allowing them to be transported more easily and making them available year-round. The rise of refrigerated rail cars and shipping containers meant that foods could be shipped across vast distances, providing access to fresh products that were once impossible to obtain. The early uses of refrigeration in the 19th century were mostly limited to preserving the wealthy's food supplies. Iceboxes were a luxury in the homes of the upper and middle classes, who used them to store fresh meat, dairy, and produce. But by the late 19th century, industrial refrigeration became more widespread, and the meatpacking industry was revolutionized. The ability to preserve and transport perishable foods meant that larger quantities of food could be produced and distributed to a growing population. By the early 20th century, refrigeration became commonplace in the homes of the middle class, and it played a significant role in the creation of modern supermarkets and food storage techniques. As the food industry became more industrialized, the Victorian grocery store evolved into what we now know as the modern supermarket. The concept of the supermarket, where customers could buy a wide variety of goods under one roof, began to emerge in the late 19th century. Early grocery stores catered primarily to the middle class, offering a mix of dry goods, canned foods, and fresh produce. However, the development of refrigerated storage allowed for a wider variety of goods, particularly perishable items like meat and dairy, to be sold in these stores. The department stores in London and other cities began to expand their offerings to include food, and the concept of a one-stop shop for all of a family's food needs gained popularity. The rise of the supermarket coincided with the growth of the consumer class in the early 20th century. The growth of cities, the increasing pace of life, and the rise of working women created a demand for convenience. People wanted to buy food quickly and easily, without having to go to multiple specialty shops. The development of the supermarket model, with its self-service layout and wide variety of goods, responded to this demand. By the early 20th century, fast food chains were emerging as a significant part of the global food economy. Inspired by the rise of quick-service dining in Victorian London, where working-class people relied on street food for convenience and affordability, fast food chains sought to offer quick, affordable meals to busy consumers. American chains like McDonald's and White Castle were founded in the early 20th century, with the goal of providing cheap, standardized meals that could be mass-produced and sold to the growing urban population. The success of these fast food chains was a reflection of the growing consumer culture in the 20th century. Just as the Victorian era had witnessed the rise of street food vendors to serve the needs of a growing industrial population, the post-Victorian era saw the development of fast food chains that could meet the demands of a modern, consumer-driven economy. Fast food chains offered a convenient alternative to cooking at home, and their affordability and consistency made them a popular choice for working families. By the mid-20th century, the globalization of fast food made it a dominant force in the food industry, and it reshaped the way people around the world consumed food. The rise of modern supermarkets and fast food chains had a profound impact on food culture worldwide. These innovations were not just about convenience. They were also about the standardization of food. The same meal could be produced and served to thousands of customers across different locations, ensuring that people all over the world could enjoy familiar meals, regardless of location. This standardization of food led to the globalization of the food industry, where products from different cultures and regions became universally available. At the same time, the rise of the global food market created a new set of challenges. The industrialization of food production led to concerns about quality and food safety, especially as large companies began to dominate the food industry. Issues such as food adulteration, sustainability, and nutritional value became central topics of debate in the food world. The rise of processed foods and artificial ingredients raised concerns about their long-term health effects, and calls for more regulation and food transparency began to grow. The legacy of Victorian food culture, from the rise of street food to the development of global trade and the industrial food system, continues to shape the food landscape today. The innovations in food preservation, refrigeration, canning, and transportation that began in the 19th century set the stage for the globalized food system that we know today. At the same time, the development of modern supermarkets and fast food chains has led to the widespread availability of affordable and convenient food to consumers around the world. However, the Victorian era also taught us the importance of food safety and sanitation. As food became more accessible and mass-produced, the need for regulations and health standards became paramount. The rise of food regulations in the early 20th century and the development of global food standards were a direct result of the lessons learned during the Victorian period. The issues of food safety, quality, and sustainability continue to shape debates about the future of food today. The food systems that emerged from the Victorian era were instrumental in creating the world of mass-produced food that we live in now. The globalization of food and the rise of convenience foods have brought unprecedented access to food across the globe, but they have also raised questions about the health effects of a food system that often prioritizes convenience over quality. These challenges will shape the future of food and eating in the years to come. But the legacy of the Victorian food revolution will remain as a defining moment in the history of food. As the world moved into the 20th century, the influence of the Victorian food revolution continued to be felt in the way food systems developed and evolved. From the rise of industrialized food production to the emergence of modern food safety standards, the innovations that began during the Victorian era laid the groundwork for the globalized industrial food systems that would dominate the following century. However, as food production and consumption scaled to meet the needs of a growing population, new questions emerged about the health impacts of mass-produced food, the sustainability of the global food system, and how food policies could evolve to ensure that nutrition and food safety remained at the forefront of the food industry. In the early decades of the 20th century, the development of food policies and regulations became a key part of the effort to ensure that the food consumed by the public was not only affordable, but also safe and nutritious. The growth of the food industry, which saw the rise of canned goods, processed foods, and fast food, created a need for government oversight to protect consumers from unsafe food handling and to ensure that food manufacturers adhered to basic health standards. The increasing availability of convenience foods and the rise of the supermarket meant that people now had access to a wider variety of foods than ever before. However, this also created new challenges, as it became clear that the industrialization of food was not without its downsides. By the middle of the 20th century, public health advocates and food safety experts began to notice the effects of the industrialization of food on public health. The increased consumption of processed foods, sugars, fats, and preservatives led to concerns about rising rates of obesity, heart disease, and other chronic health conditions. The availability of cheap, mass-produced food had made food more accessible to the masses, but it was also evident that dietary habits had shifted in ways that were not always beneficial for health. As food became more convenient, people began to consume more calories without the accompanying nutrients, leading to a rise in diet-related diseases. In response to these concerns, government food policies began to shift, and food regulation took on a more prominent role in public health. Governments around the world began to establish food standards and nutrition guidelines aimed at improving the public's health. The rise of food pyramids, dietary guidelines, and nutrition labels in the latter half of the 20th century reflected the growing awareness that food consumption needed to be balanced and that people needed to be educated about the nutritional value of the food they consumed. The introduction of food safety regulations became more stringent, with laws designed to ensure that food was free from contaminants and that producers were transparent about the ingredients in their products. One of the most significant developments in the evolution of food policies came with the introduction of public health campaigns aimed at reducing the consumption of harmful ingredients. In the mid-20th century, the rise of processed foods, which were often high in sodium, sugar, and artificial additives, raised alarms about the role of diet in chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. Governments and public health organizations began to promote healthier eating habits through public campaigns that encouraged people to consume more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, while reducing their intake of processed foods and refined sugars. One key turning point in the development of food regulation was the introduction of food labeling laws. These laws, which began to be implemented in the 1960s and 1970s, required food manufacturers to provide nutritional information on food packaging. This gave consumers the ability to make more informed choices about what they were eating, and it played a key role in shifting public awareness toward the nutritional quality of food. The introduction of calorie counts, fat content, and sodium levels on packaging was a significant step in the consumer-driven food revolution, allowing individuals to take more responsibility for their dietary choices. In recent decades, the conversation about food has expanded to include the sustainability of the food system. As the global population continues to grow, so does the demand for food. This has put a strain on agricultural systems, leading to concerns about resource depletion, environmental degradation, and climate change. The industrialization of agriculture, which began in the Victorian era, has allowed for large-scale food production to meet the demands of an ever-expanding global population, but it has also led to unsustainable practices such as overfarming, monoculture, and excessive use of pesticides. The increasing awareness of sustainable agriculture and the environmental impact of food production has led to a growing movement towards sustainable food systems. This includes practices like regenerative farming, organic agriculture, and local food production, which aim to reduce the negative environmental effects of conventional farming. The farm-to-table movement, which encourages people to eat food produced locally and sustainably, has gained popularity in recent years, particularly in urban areas where consumers are looking for alternatives to mass-produced, highly processed foods. The issue of food waste has also become a key focus in the sustainability conversation. Food waste is a major problem in both developed and developing countries, and it has been linked to the inefficiency of global food supply chains. A significant portion of food produced for human consumption is discarded before it even reaches the consumer, leading to the waste of valuable resources such as water, land, and labor. Governments and organizations around the world are working to address this issue by promoting food waste reduction strategies and encouraging consumers to be more mindful of their food consumption habits. At the same time, the fast food industry continues to be a major part of the food landscape. While fast food chains such as McDonald's, KFC, and Burger King have become ubiquitous worldwide, they also face increasing pressure to improve their offerings in response to changing consumer preferences. There's a growing demand for healthier options, including salads, plant-based foods, and lower-calorie meals. Fast food companies are now incorporating more nutritious ingredients into their menus to meet the needs of health-conscious consumers, and some are even offering vegetarian and vegan options to cater to dietary preferences. The plant-based food movement has gained significant momentum in recent years, with many people shifting away from animal-based products in favor of more sustainable, plant-based alternatives. This movement has been driven by growing awareness of the health benefits of plant-based diets, as well as concerns about the environmental impact of meat production. The rise of plant-based meat substitutes, such as those produced by companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, is a testament to the growing demand for alternative protein sources and a reflection of changing attitudes toward food production. As we look toward the future, it is clear that the evolution of food and food policies will continue to be shaped by health, sustainability, and consumer demand. The Victorian era laid the foundation for the modern food system, with its innovations in food preservation, transportation, and consumer dining habits. However, as food production becomes more industrialized and the global population continues to grow, new challenges and opportunities will arise. The future of food lies in balancing the demands of global food production with the need for sustainable practices, ensuring that food systems are able to meet the nutritional needs of a growing population without sacrificing the health of the planet. The continued development of food regulations, health initiatives, and sustainable farming practices will play a critical role in shaping how people eat and how food is produced in the years to come. The history of food, from the humble beginnings of street food in Victorian London to the globalized food economy of today, has been shaped by the changing needs of society. From the Victorian era's innovations in food preservation to the modern-day demand for sustainable food practices, the evolution of food is a story of adaptation and innovation. As we continue to confront the challenges of the future, we must remember the lessons learned from the past and continue to strive for a food system that is both nutritious and sustainable for generations to come. As the world moved into the 20th century, the influence of the Victorian food revolution continued to be felt in the way food systems developed and evolved. From the rise of industrialized food production to the emergence of modern food safety standards, the innovations that began during the Victorian era laid the groundwork for the globalized industrial food systems that would dominate the following century. However, as food production and consumption scaled to meet the needs of a growing population, new questions emerged about the health impacts of mass-produced food, the sustainability of the global food system, and how food policies could evolve to ensure that nutrition and food safety remained at the forefront of the food industry. In the early decades of the 20th century, the development of food policies and regulations became a key part of the effort to ensure that the food consumed by the public was not only affordable, but also safe and nutritious. The growth of the food industry, which saw the rise of canned goods, processed foods, and fast food, created a need for government oversight to protect consumers from unsafe food handling and to ensure that food manufacturers adhered to basic health standards. The increasing availability of convenience foods and the rise of the supermarket meant that people now had access to a wider variety of foods than ever before. However, this also created new challenges, as it became clear that the industrialization of food was not without its downsides. By the middle of the 20th century, public health advocates and food safety experts began to notice the effects of the industrialization of food on public health. The increased consumption of processed foods, sugars, fats, and preservatives led to concerns about rising rates of obesity, heart disease, and other chronic health conditions. The availability of cheap, mass-produced food had made food more accessible to the masses, but it was also evident that dietary habits had shifted in ways that were not always beneficial for health. As food became more convenient, people began to consume more calories without the accompanying nutrients, leading to a rise in diet-related diseases. In response to these concerns, government food policies began to shift, and food regulation took on a more prominent role in public health. Governments around the world began to establish food standards and nutrition guidelines aimed at improving the public's health. The rise of food pyramids, dietary guidelines, and nutrition labels in the latter half of the 20th century reflected the growing awareness that food consumption needed to be balanced and that people needed to be educated about the nutritional value of the food they consumed. The introduction of food safety regulations became more stringent, with laws designed to ensure that food was free from contaminants and that producers were transparent about the ingredients in their products. One of the most significant developments in the evolution of food policies came with the introduction of public health campaigns aimed at reducing the consumption of harmful ingredients. In the mid-20th century, the rise of processed foods, which were often high in sodium, sugar, and artificial additives, raised alarms about the role of diet in chronic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. Governments and public health organizations began to promote healthier eating habits through public campaigns that encouraged people to consume more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, while reducing their intake of processed foods and refined sugars. One key turning point in the development of food regulation was the introduction of food labeling laws. These laws, which began to be implemented in the 1960s and 1970s, required food manufacturers to provide nutritional information on food packaging. This gave consumers the ability to make more informed choices about what they were eating, and it played a key role in shifting public awareness toward the nutritional quality of food. The introduction of calorie counts, fat content, and sodium levels on packaging was a significant step in the consumer-driven food revolution, allowing individuals to take more responsibility for their dietary choices. In recent decades, the conversation about food has expanded to include the sustainability of the food system. As the global population continues to grow, so does the demand for food. This has put a strain on agricultural systems, leading to concerns about resource depletion, environmental degradation, and climate change. The industrialization of agriculture, which began in the Victorian era, has allowed for large-scale food production to meet the demands of an ever-expanding global population. But it has also led to unsustainable practices, such as over-farming, monoculture, and excessive use of pesticides. The increasing awareness of sustainable agriculture and the environmental impact of food production has led to a growing movement towards sustainable food systems. This includes practices like regenerative farming, organic agriculture, and local food production, which aim to reduce the negative environmental effects of conventional farming. The farm-to-table movement, which encourages people to eat food produced locally and sustainably, has gained popularity in recent years, particularly in urban areas where consumers are looking for alternatives to mass-produced, highly processed foods. The issue of food waste has also become a key focus in the sustainability conversation. Food waste is a major problem in both developed and developing countries, and it has been linked to the inefficiency of global food supply chains. A significant portion of food produced for human consumption is discarded before it even reaches the consumer, leading to the waste of valuable resources such as water, land, and labor. Governments and organizations around the world are working to address this issue by promoting food waste reduction strategies and encouraging consumers to be more mindful of their food consumption habits. At the same time, the fast food industry continues to be a major part of the food landscape. While fast food chains such as McDonald's, KFC, and Burger King have become ubiquitous worldwide, they also face increasing pressure to improve their offerings in response to changing consumer preferences. There is a growing demand for healthier options, including salads, plant-based foods, and lower-calorie meals. Fast food companies are now incorporating more nutritious ingredients into their menus to meet the needs of health-conscious consumers, and some are even offering vegetarian and vegan options to cater to dietary preferences. The plant-based food movement has gained significant momentum in recent years, with many people shifting away from animal-based products in favor of more sustainable, plant-based alternatives. This movement has been driven by growing awareness of the health benefits of plant-based diets, as well as concerns about the environmental impact of meat production. The rise of plant-based meat substitutes, such as those produced by companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods, is a testament to the growing demand for alternative protein sources and a reflection of changing attitudes toward food production. As we look toward the future, it is clear that the evolution of food and food policies will continue to be shaped by health, sustainability, and consumer demand. The Victorian era laid the foundation for the modern food system, with its innovations in food preservation, transportation, and consumer dining habits. However, as food production becomes more industrialized and the global population continues to grow, new challenges and opportunities will arise. The future of food lies in balancing the demands of global food production with the need for sustainable practices, ensuring that food systems are able to meet the nutritional needs of a growing population without sacrificing the health of the planet. The continued development of food regulations, health initiatives, and sustainable farming practices will play a critical role in shaping how people eat and how food is produced in the years to come. The history of food, from the humble beginnings of street food in Victorian London to the globalized food economy of today, has been shaped by the changing needs of society. From the Victorian era's innovations in food preservation to the modern-day demand for sustainable food practices, the evolution of food is a story of adaptation and innovation. As we continue to confront the challenges of the future, we must remember the lessons learned from the past and continue to strive for a food system that is both nutritious and sustainable for generations to come. As we look to the future of food, it becomes evident that we are standing at the threshold of a new food revolution, one that is being shaped by technology, sustainability, and the growing demand for personalized nutrition. The innovations that began in the Victorian era, such as canning, refrigeration, and food preservation, laid the groundwork for the global food systems that now feed billions of people around the world. However, as we face new challenges, such as the effects of climate change, the growing need for food security, and the increasing focus on health and well-being, the future of food will require continued innovation and adaptation. The rise of technology in food production has already begun to change the way we grow, process, and consume food. Precision agriculture, genetically modified crops, and vertical farming are just a few examples of how technological advancements are shaping the future of food production. These innovations allow farmers to produce food more efficiently, with less environmental impact, and in ways that were once thought impossible. For example, vertical farming uses controlled environments to grow crops in stacked layers, often in urban settings, reducing the need for large agricultural plots of land and minimizing transportation costs. This method also uses less water and fewer pesticides, making it a more sustainable option for food production. At the same time, genetically modified organisms, GMOs, are being used to create crops that are more resistant to pests, diseases, and changing climate conditions. These innovations can help ensure that we have enough food to feed the growing global population while minimizing the need for harmful chemicals and maximizing crop yields. However, the use of GMOs is not without controversy, and debates continue about the long-term health and environmental impacts of genetically modified crops. As the world continues to grapple with these challenges, the future of food will require careful regulation and oversight to ensure that technological advancements benefit everyone, not just the few. Another exciting development in food innovation is the rise of alternative proteins. With concerns about the environmental impact of traditional meat production, there has been a surge in interest in plant-based proteins, lab-grown meats, and even insect-based foods. Companies like Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods have revolutionized the food industry by creating plant-based alternatives to meat that mimic the taste, texture, and appearance of traditional animal products. These products are not only environmentally friendly, but also offer health benefits, as they tend to have fewer saturated fats and are often lower in calories than traditional meats. Lab-grown meat, also known as cultured meat, is another breakthrough in food technology. This meat is produced by growing animal cells in a lab, eliminating the need to raise and slaughter animals. This innovation has the potential to revolutionize the way we consume meat by reducing the environmental impact of traditional meat production and addressing issues related to animal welfare. Although lab-grown meat is still in its early stages, it is already making waves in the food industry and could become a mainstream product in the near future. Meanwhile, the growing popularity of insect-based food is also catching the attention of food innovators. Insects, such as crickets, mealworms, and grasshoppers, are a highly sustainable source of protein, requiring much less land, water, and feed compared to traditional livestock. As the world seeks more sustainable food sources, insects are being explored as an alternative to meat, particularly in regions where food security is a concern. Although insect-based foods are still considered a niche product in many Western countries, they are gaining popularity in parts of Asia and Africa, where insects have been a part of traditional diets for centuries. As food production becomes more sustainable, The next frontier of innovation lies in personalized nutrition, the idea that food can be tailored to an individual's genetic makeup, lifestyle, and health needs. Advances in nutrigenomics, the study of how food interacts with our genes, are paving the way for diets that are customized for optimal health. By analyzing an individual's genetic profile, researchers can identify specific nutrients that their body needs and recommend personalized dietary plans that promote health and prevent disease. This approach could revolutionize how we think about food and nutrition, shifting the focus from one-size-fits-all diets to individualized, science-based nutrition. In addition to genetic profiling, wearable health devices and mobile apps are helping people track their diets and health more closely. These technologies allow individuals to monitor their caloric intake, macronutrient balance, and even micronutrient levels, helping them make informed decisions about what they eat. The rise of meal planning apps and delivery services has made it easier for people to access personalized meal plans that suit their health goals, whether they're aiming to lose weight, build muscle, or manage a chronic condition like diabetes or hypertension. The ability to personalize food for health, convenience, and sustainability is rapidly transforming how we view food in the 21st century. The shift from traditional diets to more customized and scientifically backed nutrition plans could have far-reaching effects on public health, particularly as we face the global health crisis of rising obesity and chronic diseases. Personalized nutrition not only promises to improve health outcomes, but also holds the potential to reduce healthcare costs by preventing the onset of diet-related conditions. In addition to these technological advancements, the way we eat will continue to evolve in response to growing concerns about the environmental impact of food production. Sustainability will be a key consideration in the food systems of the future. The carbon footprint of food production, transportation, and packaging is a growing issue, and efforts to reduce food waste, decrease the use of plastic packaging, and transition to more sustainable food sources are gaining momentum. Plant-based diets, the local food movement, and the rise of sustainable food packaging are all part of a larger trend toward more eco-conscious consumption. As food systems become more sustainable, food waste remains a significant challenge. In developed countries, food waste is a major issue, with millions of tons of edible food being discarded every year. In many cases, food is wasted not because it's inedible, but because it's not properly managed or stored. Efforts to combat food waste are beginning to take shape through better food distribution, education, and the development of food waste apps that help consumers track and reduce waste. Additionally, upcycled foods, made from surplus or unsellable ingredients, are becoming a growing trend in both the food industry and among consumers who want to reduce their environmental impact. Looking forward, the future of food will not be defined by a single solution, but by the combination of technological innovations, sustainable practices, and personalized nutrition that work together to meet the needs of a growing global population. The Victorian innovations that started with the industrialization of food production paved the way for a more accessible and affordable food system, but it is the next generation of food technologies that will help us meet the challenges of the future. In the years to come, we may see food systems that are not only healthier but also more environmentally sustainable, equitable, and efficient. From lab-grown meat to plant-based alternatives, from personalized diets to eco-friendly packaging, the evolution of food will continue to reflect our changing needs and values as a society. With globalization, technology, and sustainability driving the food industry, the future of food promises to be as dynamic as the past. As we navigate this changing landscape, it is important to remember the lessons learned from our history and the impact of innovations that began in Victorian London. The journey of food, from street food vendors to global trade to personalized nutrition, demonstrates the powerful role food plays in shaping not only our daily lives, but also the future of our health and planet. Goodbye, and thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of food. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories from the past, and like the video if you enjoyed learning about how food culture evolved in Victorian London. We'd love to hear from you. Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Good night, and take care. Welcome to our channel. where we slow history down and gently explore the forgotten systems, routines, and lives that shaped the modern world. Tonight, we begin a long journey into how crime and punishment worked in Victorian London, from the earliest forms of policing to the grim realities of courts, prisons, and public justice. This story will unfold gradually, revealing how fear, poverty, order, and control shaped everyday life in one of the largest and most unequal cities in history. You'll hear about criminals and constables, laws and loopholes, punishment and survival, all woven into the rhythm of Victorian London. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us continue creating long, calm history stories like this one. And please comment below from which location you're watching. We truly enjoy reading where our listeners are joining us from around the world. Victorian London was a city of sharp contrasts. Grand buildings and gaslit streets stood beside dark alleys and overcrowded slums. Wealth and poverty existed side by side, and where poverty thrived, crime followed closely behind. For many Londoners, crime was not driven by greed or malice, but by hunger, desperation, and the constant struggle to survive. Stealing food, clothing, or coal was often a matter of necessity rather than choice. Yet the law did not always see it that way. The Victorian legal system was strict, moralistic, and often unforgiving, shaped by the belief that order must be maintained at all costs. At the beginning of the Victorian era, London did not have a professional police force as we understand it today. Law enforcement was fragmented and inconsistent. Night watchmen patrolled certain areas, often elderly men with little training, more likely to nap than to chase criminals. Parish constables existed, but they were usually unpaid or poorly paid, and many lacked motivation or authority. Crime was handled locally, unevenly, and often inefficiently. This lack of structure allowed theft, violence, and disorder to flourish, especially in densely populated areas. The city itself was a breeding ground for crime. London's population exploded during the Industrial Revolution, swelling with migrants from the countryside seeking work. Housing could not keep up. Families crowded into single rooms, sanitation was poor, and disease spread easily. In these conditions, theft was common. Pickpockets worked busy markets and streets. Burglars targeted homes at night. Gangs formed in poorer districts, especially among young men and boys, who saw crime as their only opportunity for income and belonging. Victorian society viewed crime through a moral lens. Criminals were often seen as morally corrupt, weak-willed, or sinful. This belief influenced how punishment was designed. The goal was not only to stop crime, but to deter others through fear and example. Public punishment played a key role in this system. Executions, floggings, and public humiliations were meant to send a clear message: break the law, and you will suffer. Public executions were still common at the start of the Victorian era. Crowds gathered to watch hangings, treating them as public spectacles. Vendors sold food. Children sat on shoulders, and the condemned were paraded before the public. These events were meant to terrify, but they often became grim entertainment. Over time, reformers began to argue that such spectacles hardened society rather than improving it, and that public punishment failed to reduce crime. As crime continued to rise, pressure mounted for reform. One of the most important changes came in 1829, just before Queen Victoria's reign began, with the creation of the Metropolitan Police. For the first time, London had a centralized, professional police force. Officers, often called bobbies, were uniformed, paid, and trained to patrol the streets regularly. Their presence alone began to change the city's atmosphere. Crime did not disappear, but it became more visible, more recorded, and more regulated. Early police officers were not universally welcomed. Many working-class Londoners distrusted them, seeing police as tools of the wealthy used to control the poor. Officers were sometimes attacked, mocked, or ignored. It took time for policing to become accepted as a necessary part of urban life. Gradually, as crime became more organized and violent, public opinion began to shift. The police were seen less as intruders and more as protectors, though this trust was never complete. Arrests led offenders into a legal system that was rigid and intimidating. Victorian courts were formal, hierarchical places where judges held immense power. Trials were often swift, and defendants, especially the poor, rarely had legal representation. Evidence standards were inconsistent, and social class heavily influenced outcomes. A wealthy defendant might receive leniency, while a poor offender could face severe punishment for the same crime. Punishment during this period was harsh by modern standards. Theft could result in years of imprisonment, transportation to penal colonies, or even death in earlier decades. Children were not spared. Young offenders could be imprisoned alongside adults or sent to reformatories that were often little better than prisons. The belief was that strict discipline would correct behavior, even if it caused suffering. Prisons themselves were undergoing change. Earlier prisons were chaotic, overcrowded, and violent. Prisoners mixed freely, spreading disease and criminal knowledge alike. Reformers began to argue that prisons should punish through isolation and reflection, rather than brutality. This led to the development of new prison designs focused on silence, separation, and constant surveillance. The idea was that solitude would force prisoners to confront their crimes and emerge reformed. Despite these intentions, prison life remained grim. Food was scarce and bland, work was hard and repetitive, and discipline was severe. Silence was enforced for hours or even days at a time. Mental illness was common among prisoners, though rarely acknowledged or treated. For many, prison did not reform. It broke them. Crime, policing, and punishment were deeply intertwined with class. The laws of Victorian London were written primarily by and for the upper classes. Vagrancy laws criminalized homelessness. Debt could land someone in prison. Public drunkenness, loitering, and petty theft were aggressively prosecuted, while crimes committed by the wealthy, such as financial fraud, were often handled more discreetly or leniently. Yet even within this harsh system, voices of reform grew louder. Journalists, writers, and social reformers exposed the realities of crime and punishment to the public. They wrote about overcrowded prisons, unjust trials, and the conditions that pushed people into crime in the first place. These voices did not yet change everything, but they planted seeds that would later reshape the system. As the Victorian era progressed, crime became more documented, more studied, and more feared. New types of crime emerged alongside industrialization: organized theft, professional burglary, and later more complex financial crimes. The system of policing and punishment struggled to keep pace, constantly adapting but never fully resolving the deeper causes of crime. Victorian London after dark was a city transformed. As daylight faded and gas lamps flickered into life, the streets took on a different rhythm. Quieter in the wealthier districts, but restless and unpredictable in the poorer ones. Crime did not simply vanish at night. For many, it truly began then. This was the world the early police officers stepped into, armed with little more than a uniform, a whistle, and their authority. Understanding how crime and punishment worked in Victorian London means understanding the daily realities of policing before modern technology, forensic science, or reliable communication existed. The Metropolitan Police were expected to patrol their assigned beats on foot, walking the same routes night after night. Familiarity was essential. Officers learned every alley, doorway, and shortcut, as well as the faces of residents who lived and worked along their route. A good constable was observant, calm under pressure, and able to read the subtle signs of trouble: an open door where one should not be, a broken window, a group lingering too long in the shadows. There were no radios to call for backup, no cameras to record events. If something went wrong, an officer relied on his voice, his whistle, or the hope that another officer was nearby. Policing was dangerous work. Officers faced assaults, ambushes, and retaliation, particularly in areas where criminal gangs operated. Some criminals saw police as enemies, others as obstacles to be bribed or avoided. In the poorest districts, residents often distrusted the police, believing they served the interests of the wealthy rather than the community. Officers were sometimes met with silence or hostility when investigating crimes, making their job even more difficult. Yet over time, some constables earned respect by resolving disputes, protecting residents, and maintaining a visible presence. Crime itself was varied and widespread. Theft was the most common offense, ranging from petty pickpocketing to organized burglary. Pickpockets worked in pairs or groups, often using distraction techniques perfected over years. One child might bump into a victim while another slipped a hand into a pocket. Burglars studied houses carefully, learning when residents were away and how to enter quietly. Some specialized in breaking locks, others in climbing or forcing windows. Stolen goods were quickly passed to fences, middlemen who resold items through markets or secondhand shops. Violent crime was less common than theft, but more feared. Assaults often occurred in pubs, alleyways, or crowded neighborhoods, where tempers flared and alcohol flowed freely. Domestic violence was widespread, but rarely treated as a serious crime, unless it resulted in severe injury or death. Murder, though relatively rare, shocked the public deeply and drew intense attention from both police and newspapers. Each major case fueled fears that crime was spiraling out of control, even when statistics suggested otherwise. Investigating crime in Victorian London required patience, intuition, and local knowledge. There were no fingerprints, DNA tests, or surveillance footage. Evidence came from witness statements, physical clues, and confessions, often unreliable. Witnesses could be mistaken, biased, or afraid to speak. Physical evidence was limited to items like footprints, bloodstains, or stolen property found in a suspect's possession. Confessions were sometimes coerced through pressure or intimidation, raising serious questions about justice and fairness. The rise of newspapers transformed crime into public spectacle. Sensational reporting turned criminals into notorious figures, and police investigations into ongoing dramas, followed by thousands of readers. Detailed descriptions of crimes, suspects, and trials filled daily papers. This coverage increased public fear, but also pressured the police to solve cases quickly. A failure to catch a criminal, especially in high-profile cases, damaged public confidence and fueled criticism of law enforcement. One of the most significant challenges facing Victorian police was the lack of coordination. Although the Metropolitan Police provided centralized oversight, communication between officers was slow. Messages were delivered by foot or horseback. Information about suspects or crimes could take days to spread across districts. Criminals exploited these gaps, moving between neighborhoods to avoid detection. Some even crossed city boundaries, knowing police jurisdictions were limited. Once a suspect was arrested, the journey through the justice system began. Police stations served as holding areas where prisoners awaited questioning and court appearances. Conditions were basic and often uncomfortable. Suspects could be held for limited periods, but overcrowding was common. Interrogations relied heavily on questioning rather than evidence. Officers were trained to observe inconsistencies in stories and pressure suspects into admissions, sometimes crossing ethical boundaries. Courts were intimidating spaces, especially for the poor. Proceedings were formal, rapid, and often confusing to those unfamiliar with legal language. Magistrates wielded significant power, deciding whether cases would proceed to higher courts or be resolved quickly with fines or short sentences. For minor crimes, punishment could be immediate. For serious offenses, defendants faced trial before judges and juries who often shared the values and biases of the upper classes. The concept of fairness was unevenly applied. A well-dressed defendant who spoke confidently might be viewed more favorably than a poorly clothed laborer struggling to explain himself. Character witnesses played a role, but poor defendants rarely had anyone willing or able to speak on their behalf. Legal representation was costly and uncommon for working-class people, leaving many to face the system alone. Punishment reflected Victorian beliefs about discipline and deterrence. The idea was simple: make the consequences severe enough to discourage crime. Imprisonment was common, but so were fines, corporal punishment, and in earlier decades, transportation to distant colonies. Even as some reforms softened the harshest penalties, the underlying philosophy remained strict. Criminals were expected to suffer for their actions, both as retribution and as a lesson to others. Prisons, increasingly central to the punishment system, were designed to enforce control and conformity. Silence was considered essential. Prisoners marched in single file, heads down, speaking only when permitted. Work was mandatory and repetitive: breaking stones, turning treadwheels, or picking oakum. The intention was to instill discipline and reflection, but the result was often psychological damage. Isolation led to anxiety, depression, and breakdowns, though these outcomes were poorly understood at the time. Not all crimes were treated equally. Property crimes against the wealthy were punished more harshly than violence within poor communities. Laws protected goods and money with particular intensity, reflecting the priorities of those who wrote them. At the same time, crimes committed by employers, such as exploiting workers or ignoring safety standards, were rarely punished with the same severity, even when they caused injury or death. Despite the rigidity of the system, cracks began to appear. Reformers questioned whether harsh punishment truly reduced crime or merely recycled offenders through prisons. They argued that poverty, lack of education, and overcrowding were the real causes of criminal behavior. Some suggested that rehabilitation, not fear, should be the goal. These ideas were controversial and slow to gain acceptance, but they marked the beginning of a shift in thinking. The police themselves were changing as well. Training improved gradually, discipline tightened, and standards rose. Corruption, while never eliminated, became less tolerated. Officers were expected to embody respectability and restraint, reinforcing the image of the police as guardians of order rather than instruments of oppression. This transformation was uneven and incomplete, but it reshaped public perceptions over time. Crime and punishment in Victorian London were not static systems. They evolved in response to social pressure, public fear, and political debate. Each reform addressed one problem while revealing another. Policing became more organized, yet crime adapted. Punishment became less public, yet no less severe. The tension between control and compassion, order and justice, ran through every aspect of the system. As the city continued to grow, so did the complexity of crime. New forms of wrongdoing emerged alongside new methods of enforcement. The struggle between criminals and the authorities became an ongoing contest, shaped by technology, economics, and human behavior. Understanding this struggle means looking beyond laws and institutions to the lives of ordinary people caught within them. Prisons in Victorian London were designed not merely to confine the body, but to reshape the mind. By the time Queen Victoria came to the throne, imprisonment had become the central tool of punishment, replacing many of the public and physical penalties of earlier centuries. Yet while the gallows and the whipping post slowly faded from everyday use, the prison emerged as a quieter, more controlled, and often more psychologically damaging instrument of justice. To understand how crime and punishment truly worked in Victorian London, one must step inside these institutions and experience the logic that governed them. Early Victorian prisons were grim places. Many had been converted from older buildings never intended to hold large numbers of people. Cells were small, dark, and poorly ventilated. Prisoners slept on hard boards or thin straw mattresses, often sharing space with rats and insects. Clean water was limited, sanitation was poor, and disease spread quickly. Typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis were common, and death in custody was not unusual. For many prisoners, survival itself became the primary challenge. Reformers believed that chaos inside prisons contributed to crime outside them. In earlier systems, prisoners mingled freely, sharing stories, skills, and criminal knowledge. A first-time offender might leave prison more dangerous than when they entered. To solve this, Victorian thinkers embraced the idea of separation. Isolation, they believed, would force prisoners to reflect on their crimes and emerge morally improved. From this belief came the separate system, one of the most influential and controversial prison philosophies of the era. Under the separate system, prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for most or all of their sentence. They worked alone, ate alone, and slept alone. Even during exercise or chapel services, prisoners wore hoods to prevent them from seeing one another. Silence was enforced strictly. The intention was spiritual reform, time alone with one's conscience, Bible and thoughts. In reality, many prisoners experienced intense loneliness, anxiety, and mental breakdowns. Records from the period describe hallucinations, emotional collapse, and suicide attempts, though these outcomes were often dismissed or ignored by authorities. An alternative approach, known as the silent system, allowed prisoners to work together during the day but forbade all speech. Silence was enforced through strict discipline and harsh punishment. Guards watched constantly, ready to respond to any whispered word or gesture. While this system avoided total isolation, it still placed enormous psychological strain on inmates. Human connection was denied, and communication became an act of defiance. Daily life in prison followed a rigid schedule. Prisoners woke early, often before dawn. Meals were simple and bland: bread, gruel, and occasionally vegetables or meat. Portions were intentionally small, reinforcing the idea that prison should not be comfortable. Work occupied most of the day. Tasks were deliberately repetitive and exhausting, designed less to produce useful goods and more to instill discipline. Treadwheels forced prisoners to walk endlessly without going anywhere. Oakum picking, tearing apart old rope, left hands raw and bleeding. Stone breaking served no purpose beyond punishment. Rules were absolute, and infractions were met with swift consequences. Talking, disobedience, or laziness could result in solitary confinement, reduced rations, or physical punishment. Although corporal punishment declined over the Victorian period, it did not disappear. Whippings were still used, particularly for violent offenders or those who resisted authority. Discipline was justified as necessary to maintain order and prevent rebellion. Children and young offenders were not exempt from imprisonment. Though reformatories and industrial schools were later developed, many young people still passed through adult prisons, exposed to the same harsh routines. The belief that discipline would correct behavior applied equally to children, despite growing evidence that imprisonment often hardened rather than reformed them. Some reformers argued that young offenders required education and guidance, but change came slowly. Women's prisons reflected both punishment and moral judgment. Female prisoners were often incarcerated for crimes linked to poverty, prostitution, theft, drunkenness. They were subjected to strict rules emphasizing modesty, obedience, and moral reform. Work typically involved laundry, sewing, or domestic tasks, reinforcing Victorian ideals of womanhood. Pregnant women and mothers were imprisoned as well, sometimes giving birth behind bars. Their children might remain with them briefly or be sent to workhouses, beginning a cycle of institutional life from birth. Despite the harshness of prison life, not all officials agreed on its effectiveness. Reports began to surface showing high rates of reoffending. Prison did not solve the underlying causes of crime: poverty, unemployment, overcrowding, and lack of education. Many prisoners left with fewer opportunities than before, marked by stigma and limited prospects. The system punished, but it did not heal. Outside prison walls, public attitudes toward punishment were slowly shifting. Executions moved behind closed doors, reducing their role as public spectacle. Transportation to penal colonies declined. There was growing discomfort with cruelty, even as fear of crime remained strong. Writers, journalists, and reformers documented prison conditions, exposing their realities to the wider public. Their work sparked debate about whether punishment should focus on retribution or rehabilitation. At the same time, the state expanded its reach. Prisons became more standardized, inspected, and regulated. Record-keeping improved. Prisoners were classified by offense and behavior. The system became more bureaucratic, more controlled, and more impersonal. This efficiency reduced some abuses, but also reinforced the idea that prisoners were numbers to be managed rather than individuals to be understood. For those who passed through these institutions, the experience left lasting scars. Time moved slowly. Days blended together. Silence, repetition, and isolation reshaped identities. Some prisoners emerged, determined never to return. Others, broken by the system, found themselves unable to survive outside it, and returned again and again. Prison became a revolving door rather than a final solution. Crime and punishment in Victorian London were deeply connected to ideas of morality, order, and fear. Prisons embodied these ideas in brick, iron, and routine. They reflected a society struggling to control rapid change, using discipline to impose stability. Yet beneath the rules and structures lay human lives, complex, desperate, and often misunderstood. Courtrooms in Victorian London were places where power, class, and morality converged. They were not designed to feel welcoming or fair, especially to the poor. High ceilings, elevated benches, and rigid procedures reinforced the authority of judges and the seriousness of the law. For many defendants, simply standing inside a courtroom was overwhelming. The language was formal, the rules were strict, and the outcome could alter the course of a life forever. Justice in theory was blind, but in practice, it often saw wealth, status, and respectability very clearly. Most criminal cases began in magistrates' courts. These were local courts that handled minor offenses and decided whether serious cases should proceed to higher courts. Magistrates were often middle or upper-class men, sometimes with little formal legal training. They wielded immense discretion. A defendant's appearance, speech, and perceived character could heavily influence decisions. A well-dressed, articulate person might receive a fine or warning, while a poorly clothed laborer could be sent to prison for the same offense. Proceedings were usually swift. Defendants rarely had legal representation. Lawyers were expensive, and legal aid did not exist in the way it does today. Many accused people stood alone, trying to defend themselves against charges they barely understood. Evidence was presented quickly, often based on witness testimony that could be biased, mistaken, or incomplete. The idea of innocent until proven guilty existed in principle, but in practice, suspicion alone could be enough to secure a conviction. For serious crimes, cases moved to higher courts, such as the Old Bailey. These trials attracted public attention and newspaper coverage. Courtrooms were crowded with spectators, journalists, and curious onlookers. Trials became performances as much as legal processes. Judges wore imposing robes and wigs, symbols of tradition and authority. Juries, made up entirely of men and usually drawn from property-owning classes, were expected to determine guilt or innocence, but their judgments were shaped by the values and prejudices of their time. The role of the jury was complex. In theory, it provided a safeguard against abuse of power. In reality, juries often sympathized more with victims than with defendants, especially when the accused came from the poorest districts. Crimes against property were taken particularly seriously. Stealing from a shop or employer was seen not only as a crime, but as a moral failing. Violence within families or among the poor, however, was sometimes dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable. Sentencing reflected these attitudes. Judges had wide latitude in determining punishment. They considered the crime, the defendant's past, and their perceived moral character. Repeat offenders were punished harshly, reinforcing a cycle in which poverty and prior convictions led to ever-increasing sentences. Transportation to penal colonies, once common, declined over the Victorian period, but long prison sentences filled the gap. For some offenses, particularly in earlier decades, the death penalty still loomed, though it was applied more selectively over time. Public opinion played an influential role. Newspapers reported trials in vivid detail, shaping perceptions of crime and justice. Sensational cases fueled fear and outrage, pressuring courts to appear firm and decisive. At the same time, reports of miscarriages of justice, wrongful convictions, excessive sentences sparked debate and calls for reform. The courtroom became a battleground not only for defendants, but for competing ideas about punishment, responsibility, and fairness. Women faced particular challenges in the legal system. Female defendants were judged not only for their crimes, but for their conformity to Victorian ideals of womanhood. Those accused of prostitution, theft, or drunkenness were often portrayed as morally fallen, deserving of punishment not just for breaking the law, but for violating social norms. Conversely, women who appeared modest, repentant, or respectable sometimes received leniency. Justice was deeply entangled with expectations of gender. Children, too, were processed through the courts, often with little understanding of the proceedings. Young defendants stood before magistrates and judges who believed discipline was the best teacher. While reformatories and juvenile courts emerged later in the century, many children were still tried and sentenced much like adults. Their youth might mitigate punishment, but it did not shield them from the system's harshness. The courts also played a role in reinforcing social order beyond crime. Laws against vagrancy, loitering, and public drunkenness allowed authorities to control the movement and behavior of the poor. These offenses were easy to prosecute and carried penalties that kept people cycling through courts and prisons. The legal system became a mechanism for managing poverty, rather than addressing its causes. Despite its rigidity, the Victorian legal system was not static. Gradual reforms improved procedures, evidence standards, and defendants' rights. The use of lawyers increased, jury selection evolved, and some punishments were softened. Yet progress was uneven. Old attitudes lingered, and the gap between law in theory and law in practice remained wide. For those who passed through the courts, the experience was often confusing and frightening. Decisions were made quickly, lives altered in minutes. The system valued order and authority above understanding or compassion. It was efficient, powerful, and deeply flawed, reflecting a society struggling to balance control with justice in an age of rapid change. For many offenders in Victorian London, sentencing was not the end of the ordeal. It was the beginning of a long and uncertain struggle to survive the consequences of punishment. Once a judge delivered a sentence, the individual's future followed one of several paths: imprisonment, transportation in earlier decades, hard labor, or eventual release back into society. Each path carried its own hardships, and none offered an easy return to ordinary life. Transportation, though declining during Queen Victoria's reign, still cast a long shadow over the justice system. For decades, convicts had been sent thousands of miles away to penal colonies such as Australia. The punishment was severe not only because of the labor involved, but because it severed all ties to home. Families were torn apart permanently. For those sentenced to transportation, London vanished behind them, often forever. Although the practice gradually ended by the mid-19th century, its legacy lingered in public fear and memory, shaping how people understood punishment and exile. For prisoners who served time and were released, freedom was fragile. A criminal record followed them everywhere, though it was not formalized in modern terms. Employers were reluctant to hire former prisoners, landlords refused housing, and communities treated them with suspicion. Even minor convictions could permanently mark a person as untrustworthy. Without work or shelter, many former prisoners drifted back into poverty, the very condition that had led them into crime in the first place. The stigma of imprisonment was especially harsh in Victorian society, which valued respectability above almost everything else. A single conviction could destroy a reputation beyond repair. This was particularly devastating for working-class individuals whose survival depended on daily labor and community trust. A man released from prison might find every door closed to him. A woman, especially one convicted of theft or prostitution, faced social exile that left few alternatives outside crime or the workhouse. Charitable organizations attempted to address this problem. Some reformers believed that rehabilitation required support, not just punishment. Prison aid societies emerged, offering basic assistance, temporary lodging, food, sometimes help finding employment. Religious groups emphasized repentance and moral reform, hoping to guide former offenders toward respectable lives. These efforts helped some, but resources were limited, and the scale of need far exceeded what charity could provide. Life after prison was further complicated by the conditions inside prisons themselves. Many prisoners emerged, physically weakened and mentally scarred. Years of silence, isolation, and monotonous labor left lasting effects. Some struggled with anxiety, depression, or an inability to function independently. The system expected them to reintegrate smoothly, yet offered little preparation or support. Failure was often interpreted as proof that the individual was beyond redemption, reinforcing harsh attitudes. Women faced distinct challenges upon release. Female prisoners were often sent back into the same environments that had led to their arrest: poverty, exploitation, unstable housing. Employment opportunities for women were already limited, and a criminal past narrowed them further. Domestic service was one of the few options available, but employers demanded spotless reputations. Many women found themselves trapped between social expectations and economic reality, with little room to rebuild their lives. Children released from reformatories or prisons encountered similar obstacles. Though reformers argued that youth could be redirected, society offered few opportunities for young offenders to start anew. Many returned to overcrowded homes or the streets, carrying the weight of institutional life into adulthood. The cycle of arrest, punishment, and release often repeated, not because of inherent criminality, but because of structural neglect. The workhouse loomed as an alternative for those who could not survive independently. For former prisoners, it was both refuge and threat. Entering a workhouse meant food and shelter, but at the cost of freedom and dignity. Families were separated, labor was compulsory, and conditions were harsh. For many, the workhouse felt like another form of imprisonment, reinforcing the sense that once marked by the system, escape was nearly impossible. Public attitudes toward former criminals were shaped by fear and moral judgment. Newspapers rarely followed up on what happened after sentencing. Stories ended at conviction, leaving the public with an image of crime neatly resolved. The reality, that punishment often failed to reduce crime and instead perpetuated suffering, remained largely hidden. Reformers continued to argue that without addressing poverty, education, and housing, punishment alone could never create safety or justice. Over time, some changes began to take hold. Discussions about probation, conditional release, and rehabilitation gained momentum toward the end of the Victorian era. The idea that society shared responsibility for crime, not just individuals, slowly entered public debate. These ideas did not yet transform the system, but they challenged the belief that punishment alone was enough. For the people living through it, however, the system remained unforgiving. Crime and punishment in Victorian London extended far beyond arrest and sentencing. They shaped entire lives, families, and neighborhoods. The law did not simply punish acts. It defined who could belong and who would remain forever on the margins. Some crimes in Victorian London did more than fill court records. They unsettled the entire city. These were the cases that haunted newspapers, fueled rumors, and reshaped public fear. While theft and assault were everyday realities, certain crimes pierced the Victorian sense of order so deeply that they became symbols of everything dangerous and uncontrollable about urban life. These infamous cases revealed not only the brutality of crime, but also the limitations of policing, the fragility of justice, and the anxieties of a rapidly changing society. Murder was the crime Victorians feared most, not because it was common, but because it shattered the illusion that the city could be controlled. When a body was discovered, especially in a poor district, panic spread quickly. Streets filled with gossip, suspicion, and dread. Neighbors eyed one another warily. Police investigations drew crowds, and newspapers rushed to publish every detail, accurate or not. Each murder became a public event, followed obsessively by readers across social classes. The most notorious crimes often occurred in the poorest neighborhoods, where overcrowding and poverty already bred anxiety. Narrow streets, dim lighting, and transient populations made these areas difficult to police and easy to fear. When violence struck, it confirmed middle-class fears about slums as places of moral decay. At the same time, it intensified pressure on the police to demonstrate competence and authority. Investigations into major crimes exposed the weaknesses of Victorian policing. Without forensic science, detectives relied on witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and intuition. Mistakes were common. Suspects were arrested on flimsy evidence, interrogated aggressively, and sometimes convicted despite doubts. When crimes went unsolved, public confidence eroded. The idea that criminals could vanish into the city terrified Victorians, who increasingly saw London as too large, too complex, and too anonymous to control. Newspapers played a central role in shaping this fear. Sensational headlines transformed criminals into monsters and detectives into heroes or failures. Detailed descriptions of crime scenes, victims, and suspects blurred the line between reporting and storytelling. Readers followed investigations as serialized dramas, speculating about motives and identities. This coverage increased pressure on police to act decisively, sometimes at the expense of careful justice. These infamous cases also influenced public attitudes toward punishment. Calls for harsher sentences grew louder after shocking crimes. Some argued that leniency encouraged lawlessness, while others insisted that brutality failed to prevent violence. Each high-profile case reignited debates about deterrence, rehabilitation, and the purpose of punishment. The justice system was constantly pulled between fear-driven demands for severity and reform-driven calls for humanity. Fear of crime affected everyday behavior. People avoided certain streets, altered routines, and locked doors more carefully. Women, in particular, were warned to stay vigilant, reinforcing gendered ideas about vulnerability and danger. The city's geography became moralized. Some areas were seen as respectable, others as inherently criminal. This division deepened social distance and justified unequal treatment by police and courts. Infamous crimes also revealed how deeply class influenced justice. When victims were wealthy or respectable, investigations were thorough and highly publicized. When victims were poor, attention faded more quickly. Crimes against marginalized people, especially women, the homeless, or immigrants, were often minimized or forgotten. Justice was not equally urgent for all, reinforcing the sense that the law served some lives more than others. Despite fear and sensationalism, these cases sometimes sparked reform. Public outrage over investigative failures led to improvements in policing methods. Record-keeping became more systematic. Detective work gained status and structure. Slowly, the idea emerged that understanding crime required studying patterns, environments, and motives, not just punishing offenders. These shifts marked early steps toward modern criminology. Yet, even as methods improved, fear remained a powerful force. Crime stories became part of Victorian culture, shaping literature, conversation, and identity. They reflected deeper anxieties about urbanization, anonymity, and social change. Criminals were seen not just as individuals, but as symbols of a city struggling to contain itself. For ordinary Londoners, these infamous cases were reminders that crime and punishment were not distant systems. They were forces that could reach into any home, any street, any life. The justice system, with all its authority, could not guarantee safety or fairness. It could only respond, often imperfectly, to the consequences of deeper social problems. As the Victorian era moved toward its end, the balance between fear and reform continued to shift. Crime did not disappear, but the ways it was understood began to change. The focus slowly expanded, from punishment alone to prevention, from spectacle to study, from moral judgment to social responsibility. As we come to the end of this long journey through crime and punishment in Victorian London, it becomes clear that the system was never just about law-breaking and discipline. It was a reflection of a society struggling to manage rapid change, overwhelming growth, and deep inequality. The streets, courts, prisons, and police stations of Victorian London formed a vast mechanism designed to impose order on a city that often felt uncontrollable. Yet beneath that mechanism were human lives, fragile, complex, and shaped as much by circumstance as by choice. Victorian crime was inseparable from poverty. Overcrowded housing, insecure work, hunger, and lack of education created conditions where crime became, for many, a means of survival. The justice system rarely addressed these root causes. Instead, it responded with punishment, believing that fear and discipline would preserve order. Policing grew more professional, courts more structured, and prisons more systematic. But the underlying philosophy remained focused on control rather than understanding. The creation of a modern police force marked a turning point. Regular patrols, uniforms, and centralized authority reshaped how London functioned. Crime became something to be monitored, recorded, and managed. This brought greater consistency, but also expanded the state's power over everyday life. The police became symbols of order, yet also reminders of surveillance and authority, especially in poor communities where trust remained fragile. Prisons, too, evolved into institutions of routine and isolation. They were meant to reform, but often punished without healing. Silence, separation, and labor were imposed in the belief that they would correct moral failure. Instead, many prisoners left more damaged than before, unprepared for life outside, and marked by stigma that followed them everywhere. Release did not mean freedom. It meant survival in a society unwilling to forgive. Courts reinforced social hierarchies. Justice was shaped by class, gender, and respectability. The same act could lead to different outcomes depending on who committed it and how they were perceived. Law promised fairness, but practice delivered something uneven and often harsh. Yet within this system, debates grew louder. Reformers questioned cruelty, Journalists exposed abuses, and public opinion slowly shifted. Infamous crimes intensified fear, but also forced reflection. They revealed the limits of punishment and the impossibility of absolute control. Each unsolved case, each wrongful conviction, chipped away at confidence in the system. Gradually, the idea emerged that crime could not be solved by punishment alone, that prevention, education, and social reform mattered just as much. By the end of the Victorian era, the foundations of the modern justice system were in place. Policing, prisons, and courts had become permanent features of urban life. Their flaws were evident, but so was their influence. The debates that began in Victorian London about punishment versus rehabilitation, authority versus fairness, fear versus compassion, continue today. Looking back, crime and punishment in Victorian London teach us that justice is never static. It is shaped by values, power, and the willingness to see people not just as offenders, but as products of their environment. The Victorian system sought order above all else. In doing so, it left behind lessons written in stone walls, iron bars, and quiet suffering. Lessons that still echo in the systems we live with now. And now, as the gaslights fade and the city grows quiet once more, our story reaches its end. Good night, and may these slow reflections on history ease your thoughts and guide you gently into rest.